Welcome to the SaaS Backwards Podcast, where we reverse engineer the success of fast-growing SaaS firms and explore strategies CMOs and CEOs are using to drive their businesses forward.
Welcome to SaaS Backwards, a podcast that helps SaaS CEOs and CMOs to accelerate growth and enhance profitability. Our guest today is Parthi Loganathan. He's the CEO at Letterdrop, a platform that uses AI to sift through your recorded sales calls and provide content that's super relevant to your audience. As content marketers ourselves, we're excited to hear about this type of product because we're always talking about how you should be interviewing salespeople and understanding what's coming up in the sales calls to develop content strategy. Parthi, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
You bet. So just share with me, before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, just share with me a little bit of the genesis of your company and how you came to start it in 2021.
Absolutely. So the company actually started off solving slightly different problems. For context, I was a product manager at Google on the search team as well as on G Suite back in the day. And I had quit to work on just starting a company. I had worked on some micro SaaS apps, which I was growing. And I had actually hired an agency to help me grow one of those businesses. And I just had a terrible experience with them. And so that triggered me getting into growth myself and trying to really understand the fundamentals of it. And that was essentially the genesis of Letterdrop. So we started off by helping companies B2B companies drive qualified inbound traffic using SEO that isn't really about creating spam or volume, but really trying to figure out how to attract buyers who are actually going to enter your sales cycle. So that's what we've been doing for the past 2 years or so. And we have a lot of great logos and a sizable customer base off of that. But things have been changing. I think in the past year or so, a couple of things we observed where a lot of companies were diversifying what they mean by content and how buyers actually consume content. And at least in the B2B space, LinkedIn has sort of emerged as a heavy hitter in terms of how people are consuming, what's influencing their purchase decisions. But I think the fact that it's really about relationships and business relationships and people makes it a little bit more trustworthy as well, where people can actually see your background, your history, and understand like who you are when you produce content. And so we've been leaning very heavily into that in the past 6 months or so, where we've really been helping companies try to figure out how they can uncover more pipeline from LinkedIn by turning essentially their team execs, sellers, anybody customer facing into social sellers so that they can actually drive more inbound pipeline and identify warm leads who are in market so that they can actually do smarter outbound as well.
So now the AI is basically listening into a lot of these sales calls and proposing topics and actually helping to generate content for use on LinkedIn, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of people obviously are very skeptical about AI generated content as they should be. And if you were to go ask ChatGPT to create something for you about a topic, it's going to be fairly generic. It's an amalgamation of the average of what the internet has to say about a topic, more or less, right? Which isn't necessarily super interesting to most people. And so what we're trying to do when we think about content is we don't think about it in terms of content. We think about it in terms of how do we actually get the conversations you're having with your customers? How do we get your internal data? And how do we turn that into collateral that you can share? So it's really not ChatGPT coming up with stuff. It's essentially just AI massaging and kind of like putting together actual conversations that you're having today. And so we hook up to your sales calls, like your Gong, Chorus, Clary, etc. And then we pull out the golden nuggets that are coming from those kinds of conversations and discovery calls with your customers. This helps you actually create content that's going to resonate with more buyers like them, because if one person's asking you a question, you can probably bet that there's 100 other prospects who are thinking the exact same thing. So that kind of takes care of topic coverage for you in terms of like what's relevant. And the second thing is you're using actual language from your customers. You're using the language that they use to describe problems that they have, how they view your solution, as well as getting actual answers from these sales conversations, whatever advice your reps, assuming they're good reps, and providing actionable advice on these calls. We can pull that out and we combine that with your sales decks, your blogs, your webinars, your podcasts, all that kind of stuff to turn it into fairly compelling thought leadership without you having to do much. And so when you reduce the work that AI is doing to just putting together existing material, it actually improves the quality quite drastically. And so in my case, about half my content on LinkedIn is actually generated by Letterdrop. I make very few edits to it. I have about 12,000 followers on LinkedIn. 64% of our pipeline is from LinkedIn, which we can also measure with Letterdrop. And so it's just testament to it actually being a powerful revenue driver, and it doesn't take me all that much time to do it. And we've seen the same with many of our customers, companies like Clay and CRS Credit.
And you mentioned before starting out in more of the SEO world, and I'm assuming that you were using the same technology to find keyword topics, but have kind of pivoted away from that toward LinkedIn. And you said that that was in the last 6 months or a year that you made that pivot?
Yes, that's right. We actually started hooking up to sales calls because we were actually looking for questions that customers might be asking in calls that they also might be searching on Google. So that's where we started. And then we just realized, hey, this is actually a treasure trove of data. And maybe writing like a really long blog post is hard off of the information you can find in a call. But writing shorter thought leadership content for LinkedIn is very doable using that information. And so we realized that and pushed that out, and reception has been really positive for that. In fact, I'll get on demos. I'll tell people, hey, like bring in a transcript or two where you feel like there's some juicy information, and we'll let them run it through Letterdrop live. And in a few minutes, they have like a week's worth of content, like really good content to go out. So yeah, it works pretty darn well. And we started doing it because we hooked into sales calls for SEO initially.
I also wondered there if you're seeing a similar shift away from SEO in general. You know, we recently interviewed Rand Fishkin on the podcast, and he talks about how, you know, the SEO as we know it in, say, 2015 or so is really kind of on a steep decline. There's just too much content out there. AI snippets are driving more of the top search results, pushing everything down. And really, it's the big publishers that are getting resonance on organic search. And so if you're a smaller player, it's really hard to compete. And I just wondered if that was one of the reasons, or if you're seeing the same thing in terms of kind of switching over to LinkedIn as a opportunity.
We have a lot of customers who are making like big plays with SEO. And what I will say is that SEO has gotten more challenging than it was previously. I think in the past, you could produce some pretty crappy content and get away with it. And I think a lot of people will still think about SEO that way, which is also why it has a bad rep. I believe that in order to succeed moving forward with SEO, it just requires more effort. Companies need to really think about telling stories that are unique, that are not just essentially an amalgamation of what's already ranking out there today. And that's work. And I think a lot of companies haven't made that mental shift to be like, hey, like we can't just farm out SEO to third parties or just publish a whole bunch of pages with ChatGPT. We actually have to think about collecting data, writing reports, interviewing subject matter experts, and putting out content. And because of that, I think a lot of CMOs have decided that it's a lot of work and they're uncertain about what the future of Google looks like as a channel. And so they've in some ways paused their investments, or they're very careful about their investments in SEO. I don't think the channel as is has declined in any way, meaningful way. We are seeing our own traffic climb quite drastically month over month still. So it's still a great channel. I think the way people have to approach it has changed. And I don't think we as an industry, like practitioners, a lot of marketers are not ready for that conversation yet. And so we'll see what happens there. In the meantime, at least at Letterdrop, we just realized, well, we're not going to wait around for a bunch of CMOs to make up their minds on SEO. We can still help companies drive pipeline and produce great content. And let's go figure out where they are making their investments. And a lot of them were investing in organic social, right? I think there's a lot of tailwinds around social selling. There's lots of great examples of executives and salespeople who are actually driving a lot of pipeline that way. Adam Robinson from our B2B in the past 6 months has made a big splash on LinkedIn. I think even the CEO of ZoomInfo is starting to get much more public on Twitter and LinkedIn. And yeah, just overall, I'm seeing way more people realize that, hey, like here's an unfair advantage that we have by actually warming up our audience, building trust online so that when I do outbound to them, I'm much more likely to get a response from them because they're familiar with us, they're educated about the problems that we solve, and they know our name. And they're also driving additional inbound as well. So it's not just like creating the opportunity for outbound, but it also is driving inbound as well. So I'm really excited about that. I think every go-to-market team in B2B should be investing in some capacity. If you're buying sales nav or attempting to LinkedIn DM somebody, it's also a sign that you should also probably be posting content on LinkedIn as well, because that's just going to accelerate your success quite dramatically.
Yeah, no doubt. Speaking of like outbound sales tactics and things like that, what are your thoughts about the decline of some of the traditional outbound sales tactics like cold calling and cold emailing? And how are you advising sales teams to adapt to those changes?
So what I will say is that I think cold email and calling are still very important. Like sending email and calling are very important. I don't want to make any hyperbolic statements like cold calling is dead or cold email is dead. I think that's not fair. However, what we are witnessing is that the efficacy of those channels, they do see diminishing returns. So I think a couple of years ago, everyone was following this predictable revenue playbook where your answer to more pipeline was, let's just hire more SDRs. Every incremental SDR is hopefully going to bring in an equivalent amount of pipeline just by hitting the phones up more, just by sending more cold email. And I think what people are starting to realize is, especially in this kind of macro climate where there's tightened budgets, a very small percentage of your market is actually ready to purchase at any point in time. You hitting them up more and spamming them more is not going to change that. People buy when they want to buy. All you can do is be top of mind and be in front of them. And so economically, it no longer makes sense for you to just keep increasing headcount and increasing volume of outbound. And instead, you need to reconsider the type of activity you're doing. So you should still be cold calling, you should still be cold emailing, but you should be thinking about, who are you emailing? Who are you calling? Why are you calling them? Have I observed something about their business that warrants calling them? For everybody where it doesn't make sense for me to necessarily reach out to them right now just because they're not in market, how do I stay top of mind? How do I build those relationships? And how do I build that relationship not only with our brand as a company, but how do we build those personal relationships between our SDR or AE or executive with the decision makers and ICs at our target audience, right? I think a lot of people overlook that and are trying to continue to scale this old model, which is just not working quite as well. So yes, increasing activity on cold calling and email alone is not the answer. You need to change the type of activity you need to do, but that doesn't mean that they're dead. It just means you have to approach them a little bit differently and be more judicious about how you employ them.
Yeah, I really hate the conversations about anything being dead. Of course, it's not dead, but I do think that it's scaling that's the issue, right? Like the predictable revenue model was built around a scalable model in 2015 when content wasn't as big as it is now. And the problem is if you're trying to scale context and relevance, it's very hard to do that. And in fact, I caught a webinar just yesterday with Josh Braun, and he was talking about how everybody's asking him, well, how do you scale this if you've got to have some kind of context and relevance? And the answer is you don't. You have to get the context and relevance right first before you can scale it. And so that's what I like about your system, is that you are using some typical things that are crossing over what they're hearing on the sales calls. Now that's something that is potentially scalable, right?
Yes, correct. So let's think about what your average AE or SDR can do, right? Like you spend money on headcount. And now how are you thinking about their activity? You're going to be like, okay, like my SDR is going to make 200 calls this week, and they're going to send out 100 emails this week. And that's how you think about them. And quite frankly, some of that activity, like AI is going to replace some of that like more mundane activity. Really, the SDR is going to be focused more so on relationship building. That's where they need to be focused. And so I think the thing that people don't think about is like, okay, we have a person here. How do we actually get them to go build relationships? It's called business development for a reason. Like, how do we get them to go build relationships? And the best way for them to do that is to publicly showcase, like, hey, here are problems that are relevant to you. Here's how our company thinks about solving these problems. Here's advice we've given out. They don't necessarily need to be an expert themselves. You would hope that every salesperson tries to become as much of an expert as they can in what they sell. But what you can do is you can just tell stories. You can tell stories around like what you're hearing from your customers pretty scalably, and start putting out content so that essentially your SDR becomes a curator of information. And so people start going to this person for information, which that SDR is learning from peers through like discovery calls that your company is having, essentially. And so I think that's where like content really scales. And said, it's really hard to get your 100 emails to be read. It's really easy for a single LinkedIn post to be viewed by 2,000, 3,000 people who are in your target audience. It's really good for some subset of those people to actually like, comment, visit your website, view a profile, give you some sort of indication that they're paying attention. And if you accumulate enough of those signals, that starts to tell you or paint a picture in terms of the topics that this potential buyer is interested in. If you were to reach out to them, what would you want to say based on like what they care about? And so essentially creating content is creating surface area for signals, for you to collect signals and create triggers for you to actually do thoughtful outreach. And so I think that's really where people need to be focusing the SDR BDR's role, is help them do more relationship building scalably, and then only focus on reaching out to people when there is a reason to reach out.
Well, and I think that is a good segue into the next question about providing value, or what does that mean, or how is your system helping the SDRs provide value instead of, developing commission breath, as Josh Broughton calls it?
Yeah, I think, and look, like I get it. I think we live in a world where, especially sales as an industry, is very short-term focused. Every person, like you're evaluating people on monthly targets. If you're in week 3 of a month and you're not hitting targets, people get nervous. People are like, okay, like how do I fix this? Maybe I'm just going to go spam more people, and maybe somebody's going to respond to me so I can book a meeting.
Well,
And
that used to work. That's the
it
problem.
used to work. And honestly, it still will work. It's just like the ratio of calls to successful meetings booked is just making no sense economically at some point. That's really what's happening.
Right.
And I think the byproduct of this is that you're annoying people, right? Like you're starting to carelessly or thoughtlessly reach out to people. You're occupying space in their inbox. They're already really busy, and you're reaching out to them without a good reason to reach out to them. And that's just going to honestly like piss people off. That builds a poor taste in their mouth for that individual or that brand, and they don't actually want to do business with you anymore. So you're actually hurting yourself by sort of being greedy about who you reached out to. And so
And hurting the industry too, because
exactly.
The first thing that happens when I get a cold call is I know how it's going to go, and it's going to be just like everybody else, and nobody's actually going to try to add value to what I'm doing or ask questions or try to poke a hole in what I'm doing now that may be done in a better way.
Exactly. And I honestly, it's a tragedy of the commons. Everybody wants pipeline, and everybody thinks like, okay, I can just incrementally like do more activity. And then what they don't realize is that the person on the other end has limited bandwidth in order to entertain all of this outbound from all these people. And the more people do it, the more noise becomes. And so if you want to stand out, the easiest way to stand out is to stop making an ask for their time immediately, because that's what you're doing, right? You're essentially saying, hey, can I take 30 minutes of your time and can you get on a demo? And if 80 people are doing that to me every day, I just simply don't have the time to meet with all of you. I'm sorry. You need to give me like a really good reason for wanting to take that call. And the best way and I can't read all 80 of those emails, the best way to do that is to actually be somebody who has already built some trust and provided some value. So stop asking me for my time and instead try to figure out, what can you give me right now that's going to make my day better? Can you help me understand an inefficiency in my business? Can you share something educational from a peer in the industry about how they're doing something that I should consider doing? Can you change my way of thinking? Can you add value first? And now I view you as a person who's already solved a problem for me. Like, you've already educated me in some capacity. Maybe this person can help me in more ways. It is actually worth it for me to probably spend 30 minutes with this person on a call and to view a demo, because they've already shown that they can understand my business, that they can identify problems I might be facing, and they can already like provide value for me for free. I'm more inclined to want to actually continue the conversation. And so I think that's where a lot of SDRs get it wrong, where they have commission breath. They're just like they're all focused on the meeting instead of building the relationship, which will eventually lead to a meeting when the buyer is ready.
Absolutely. And I know we talked a little bit in the prep call about understanding the customer's unmet needs. And I really like that, the way that you phrase that. But talk about how your product is doing that through the sales calls.
Yeah. So if you think about like, what is your best source of information in a company to understand your company's, and any good product marketer, what they will do is they will sit down and they'll try to figure out who are our best customers, who are the customers who were easy to sell to, who onboarded quickly, who are renewing with us, who are not churning, getting value, turning to case studies. Who are these people? We should try to figure out how to find more of those people. That's our fastest way to grow. That's what a good product marketing team will do for you. And even like a good head of sales will identify that and verticalize who they reach out to, and they'll start targeting their teams around that. And so what we're doing with sales calls are a phenomenal way for you to understand amongst your current customers or current prospects, what do they care about? And so if your goal is to figure out, okay, how do I find 100 other prospects who look like this prospect who's already interested in my solution, who's already thinking about problems that I can solve, whatever they say is just pure gold for you. Whatever questions they have, whatever problems they have, they're probably representative of 100 other best fit customers. And so in Letterdrop, what we're really doing is we're trying to take those questions from those types of customers, and then we essentially automatically turn that into something that you can turn into thought leadership or post on LinkedIn. And so now if you as an SDR or an AE or an executive are going and connecting with those 100 other prospects who look the same as this one that you have in your pipeline, and you're sharing information that you know was already relevant to that first prospect, you're going to start becoming a magnet for those 100 others. They'll start seeing you in their feed, or if you send them a connection request, they'll see your content and be like, hey, yeah, I do want to connect with this person. It's almost like they understand what's going on in my brain. They just truly, deeply understand me. And that's really what's going to help you build trust. That's really going to help you connect with these people. That's what's going to help you book those meetings, because you're just speaking their language. You're taking what you heard from one person and you're scaling it to 100 other people. And I think that's similar to what the product marketer is doing in terms of the collateral for your website. What we're trying to do is like do the same thing for collateral in terms of thought leadership or content, value-added content that you can use to attract those other best fit customers. So I think that's where you really find those unmet needs that customers are bringing to conversations. And you're essentially broadcasting to the world, like, hey, if you do have these unmet needs that you didn't even know that you had, like, you should be talking to us. And this is the advice we gave somebody who looks like you. That is a way more effective way than just shoving your product down somebody's throat and saying like, hey, like you should take a demo and buy for me because for like XYZ reason, when they don't even realize that they have a pain point.
Yeah, interesting. Last question. I want to talk a little bit about where you see things going on LinkedIn. I play around with content quite a bit on LinkedIn. Of course, recommend that our clients do it. But the reality is that I think all of us are getting more, sales messages and people that connect and then turn around and try to pitch me something. And so what's the future opportunity on the channel? How hard is it's getting harder to compete in terms of content? So what are your recommendations there in terms of how to compete? And then what happens when this channel becomes Googletized?
Well, Google had a 15-year run, so you're
That's true.
gonna take a little longer for LinkedIn to get there. I still think it's like under 1% of people on LinkedIn who are actually creating content, so it is very untapped. I see this with the people we sell to, right? Like we go into a company and the de facto situation is nobody's posting. Like maybe there's this one person who's pretty ambitious and they've cracked the code and they're trying to do it, but everybody else is kind of sticking to their old playbooks. And so I think it's still like very untapped. Yes, it has gotten harder over time, and that's true for any channel. If you think LinkedIn is saturated, let me tell you, cold calling and cold emailing are way more saturated. I would say like right now in 2024, it is still like a really, really good channel. I think it's one of those channels where there's a face to a name and you can see people's history, you can see who they are, as opposed to I think with email or calling, it feels a little bit more impersonal. Who's a stranger who just gave me a call? Who's a stranger in my inbox? Versus here's somebody in a feed. Here's social proof of other people engaging with them. Here's them. Here's our mutuals. You can see all the stuff, which makes you want to pay more attention. And then also your LinkedIn DMs are a much more sacred channel than in your email inbox or cold calling. Like I receive like so many calls per day. If it's an unknown number, I don't pick up unless I was expecting a call. My inbox in Gmail, if I don't recognize the name, I'll maybe take a look at the subject line real quick, and then otherwise it's straight to trash. If you DM me on LinkedIn, I need to have accepted your connection. I ignore emails because they're paid and I know that's spam. But if you're DMing me on LinkedIn, we are connected. And so I decided you were a person that was worthy of being in my connections. And the way you do that is by building trust, by posting content, by doing all that other stuff ahead of time. And so I think it's a much better channel to get reach, both at scale as well as like contact somebody one-on-one than calls or email. That said, it's going to vary from industry to industry, right? So if you're in certain types of industries like big pharma or something like that, and they just simply are not on LinkedIn, like don't try to force a channel where it's not going to work. But if you're in most industries, if you're in sales, marketing, HR, cybersecurity, selling to IT decision makers, CTOs, and honestly, this covers quite a bit. Like even people in construction, like BIM managers and I've seen all kinds of people see a lot of success on LinkedIn. So there's more people on LinkedIn than you would think.
Yeah, we have a client in that space, right? And we're seeing more of those BIM managers on LinkedIn all the time.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
becoming a channel that's working in terms of advertising.
Right. And if you told me that a year ago or 2 years ago, I'd be like very skeptical of that. But here we are and we see the proof.
Well, that's great. That sounds like a good place to kind of land the episode. If people want to get in touch with you and hopefully get a demo of your product, how would they do that?
Sure. You can reach out. You can email me. I'm Parthi at letterdrop.com, Parthi. But you can also search for me on LinkedIn. I'm very, very, very loud on LinkedIn, posting every day. And you can get a flavor for who I am and what we do. Very public about it. So just give me a follow or feel free to connect with me. And if you want to try Letterdrop, feel free to reach out. If you want to come in with a couple of transcripts from your sales calls, on the very first call, I'll give you a week's worth of content absolutely free. Like we can workshop it together for you too.
That's a hell of an offer. So hopefully the people will take you up on that. Anyway, thanks for being on the podcast. And thanks for listening to the podcast as well, brought to you by Austin Lawrence Group. We are a growth marketing agency that helps firms reduce churn, accelerate sales, and generate demand. You can learn more about us at austinlawrence.com. And I hope you consider subscribing, and thanks again for listening.
Thanks for listening to the SaaS Backwards Podcast, brought to you by Austin Lawrence Group. We're a growth marketing agency that helps SaaS firms reduce churn, accelerate sales, and generate demand. Learn more about us at www.austinlawrence.com. You can email Ken Lempet at kl@austinlawrence.com about any SaaS marketing or customer retention subject. We hope you'll subscribe, and thanks again for listening.